Let's bring in New Jersey Attorney General Matt Platkin. Attorney General Platkin. So we have something called the United States Constitution. Then Donald Trump, by executive order, not even a law, an executive order, says, I don't like birthright citizenship. It's about slavery or whatever he's saying right there. Your state kicked into high gear, filed one of the first lawsuits on this. Now you're in front of the Supreme Court. Tell us about the oral argument, what you expect, and what this case is all about.
Well, first, thanks for having me. And yeah, what the president said there and what he said, frankly, in his executive order at 8 p.m. on the first day in office, trying to be the first president in 157 years to take the interpretation that he just said, to rewrite the plain text of the 14th Amendment, that after a civil war, we came together as a nation and said, never again are we going to debate whether babies born on U.S. soil are in fact entitled to the rights and privileges of U.S. citizenship. We settled that with the Civil War. And for a century and a half, the Supreme Court and basically everyone in the United States understood that that was the way citizenship worked. And now we'll be leading the argument at the Supreme Court on behalf of a coalition of states that sued immediately. We were in court the next morning after he filed that order because it affects us. It affects our residents and it affects us as states. And think about this. They want to say that in this phase, they want to say that citizenship is decided based on whether or not your state attorney general joined our suit. So for New Jersey, if you're a parent giving birth in South Jersey, well, a lot of those parents go to Philadelphia hospitals. And so Pennsylvania is not in our suit. So they would say that your citizenship is decided based on which hospital you go to for residents in our state. No one seriously thinks the Constitution works that way. It hasn't worked that way since the Civil War, and I'm confident we're going to prevail next week.
What do you think, though, about the procedural posture of this? Because, the merits of the birthright citizenship issue, at least I think before the Supreme Court, is a little bit secondary to the nationwide injunction issue about whether a federal court sitting in one district can basically issue an overall injunction blocking actions throughout the nation. Now, former President Biden was in office. We see the Trump administration use this over and over and over again. Tell us, though, procedurally, is this case focused on the merits? Is it going to get into the constitutional right of birthright citizenship? Or when we watch the oral argument, is it going to be a little bit, focused on nationwide injunctions and the merit there?
Well, again, I think you're right that there's been some hypocrisy in terms of when this administration does and doesn't like nationwide injunctions. But put aside that debate for a second. Our position here is clear. I don't see how you could consider whether this order should apply to every state without considering the merits of what we're talking about. I gave you the example earlier about the child being born in Philadelphia who lives in South Jersey. But just think about it for a second. I mean, we were talking earlier. You and I both lived in different states. Most Americans have lived in different states throughout their lives. And people move in this country. So what this court would be saying, if in fact it's saying, no, it only applies, this injunction right now only applies to the states that are in this suit, meaning the states that have brought suit against the administration, then effectively each state would be in a position, and the residents of our state would be parsing through who's a citizen and who isn't based on which state they live in at the time of their birth and potentially where they move to. No one seriously thinks the 14th Amendment or the constitutional rights of this nation apply to you based on which state you live in. But that's effectively the argument that the administration, the Trump administration, is making to the court.
I want to switch topics and talk about these big law firms that have been capitulating. I had Dean Chemerinsky, right now he's the dean of UC Berkeley, on, and he's started UC Irvine, a legend. He said, that the profession in general should be ashamed of itself, I think was the words that he used for how some of these lawyers have been behaving in capitulating for Donald Trump. We saw Justice Sotomayor come out and speak publicly, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, saying, look, if you're not equipped to defend the Constitution and be courageous, then just don't be a lawyer. Don't come into this profession. And to see, Supreme Court justices outspoken like that is something, I think worth noting as well. what's going on? What do you see, here? What's your views of it all?
Yeah, I think this is a look yourself in the mirror moment as an attorney. Do you stand for the things that we've said we stand for? Are you willing to uphold the oath that you took to uphold the Constitution and zealously advocate for your client, something that we are all obligated to do? And I've been very disappointed in what we as attorneys general have collectively called a capitulation by some of the most powerful law firms to what are clearly illegal and unconstitutional orders issued by the president, targeting lawyers for doing their job, targeting lawyers for taking cases and bringing their clients' interests to court. And look, I'm the attorney general of my state. I represent 9.5 million people. I am routinely on the other side of the table with lawyers, including some of the very law firms that I'm in court now standing up for and saying their right to zealously advocate for their clients cannot be then flipped on its head and have them targeted and have their business model targeted by an administration who doesn't like it. I would never even contemplate doing that as the attorney general, much less actually implement it. And so this is bigger than just any one firm. This is about whether the attacks on the press, the attacks on the universities, the attacks on people's right, their First Amendment right to go to court and advocate for their interests, whether those rights are going to stand. And if they don't, then we are clearly on the path to authoritarianism in this country. And so this is a really big fight. And I've very much been disappointed in some of my colleagues in the profession who have not recognized the significance of this moment and have instead put their own personal self-interest ahead of the interest of this nation.
You mentioned universities as well. I mean, and you've seen different universities respond differently as well. We've seen some universities step up. We've seen some universities sign these ridiculous contracts in principle, giving the Trump regime who knows what they think they're giving him. But with Trump, if you give him an inch, he takes much more than that. Talk to us about the efforts from your office also, though, just in general with education. Trump's attack on education, everything from trying to rip school lunches out of the mouths of children, to gutting funding at universities. It's systemic at every level, a dismantling of education.
Yeah, this has been the most anti-education, anti-public education administration, maybe in the history of this nation. Certainly incredibly hostile to what every American relies on. 85% of Americans send their kids to K through 12 public schools. And yet on Valentine's Day, literally as I'm having dinner with my wife, we get a letter from the Federal Department of Education saying, if your school had a Black History Month event or a Lunar New Year event or honored Martin Luther King Day, you can lose the entirety of your federal funding. So just think about that. You have parents of kids with special needs. If you're a parent of a kid with autism, this administration has said if you have one of those events, which by the way, the president had a Black History Month event in the Oval Office, and by the own terms of his own orders, he would lose federal funding for doing that. That parent of that kid with autism might lose the aid that they rely upon every day who takes care of their child. And at the university level, they have threatened to cripple institutions of higher education strictly for unrelated political purposes. I mean, threatening to revoke the entirety of NIH funding, which, by the way, ensures that people on clinical trials for cancer and Alzheimer's can get their treatments. I mean, raise your hand if you think the American public went to the polls last November to cap administrative fees for NIH grants. Nobody knows what that is. But the upshot is every university in America, in red states and in blue states, would be shut down overnight if the order that we blocked was allowed to go into effect. So this is extreme. And again, it's part of a pattern of attacking critics of his. Universities, the press, lawyers, people who do their job, myself and my colleagues in our coalition. But I know that there are a number of people who have stood up like us and are not going to back down in the face of what are really authoritarian threats on our rights in this country.
I try to focus our audience here. There's so much going on. It's sometimes like whack-a-mole, right? We talked about executive orders on birthright citizenship. We talked about him gutting universities. We talked about him disappearing human beings to, CCOT in El Salvador. When I spoke to Attorney General Bonta of California, we talked about Trump attacking things like the Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles, two other museums throughout this, going after like funding of museums. I've talked to lawyers about Trump gutting Smithsonian museums and taking artifacts out of the African American history. I mean, the line